When the gatekeeper stood to defend the billionaire woman no one dared to represent, he didn't just open a courtroom battle. He reopened a wound the world tried to forget. The courtroom was colder than it should have been. The kind of sterile, fluorescent cold that scraped against your nerves like static. Eleanor Storm sat alone at the defendant's table, her back impossibly straight, her hands resting calmly on her lap as if she were attending a board meeting instead of a criminal trial. The name Storm Tech on the docket now sounded more like irony than empire. Across from her, an entire wall of polished men in tailored suits leaned toward the prosecution bench. Behind them, 5 reporters, 3 legal interns, and 1 girl chewing the end of her pencil so hard it was nearly gone. But the seat beside Eleanor, where her defense attorney should have been, remained empty. The judge adjusted his glasses. "Is Miss Storm's counsel running late?" Silence. Not a breath in the room. The absence wasn't a surprise to Eleanor. Her legal team had resigned just 22 hours before, after a sealed document leaked suggesting her involvement in a multi-billion-dollar embezzlement scheme. Overnight, she had gone from tech visionary to national disgrace. She didn't even look up at the judge. She'd stopped hoping anyone would stand beside her a long time ago, until she heard a throat clear from the back of the room. Heavy boots, worn soles, and a voice, rough but calm. "I will represent Miss Storm, Your Honor." Heads swiveled. The bailiff blinked. Even the prosecutor, a man known for sneering through entire hearings, sat back. From the last row, a man stepped forward. Mid-50s, salt and pepper beard, navy blue jacket faded from sun and years. He walked slowly, not with the swagger of a lawyer, but the weight of someone used to being ignored. His name tag, half hidden under his coat, read Storm Tech Facilities Access Control. Caleb Mercer, the gatekeeper. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, sir. Who exactly are you?" "I work in building security for Storm Tech," Caleb replied evenly. "But I studied law before life took me somewhere else. I never passed the bar, but I know this case better than anyone in this room. I've seen the surveillance. I've seen the silence." Eleanor turned, finally. Her lips parted just slightly. She hadn't seen Caleb in weeks, not since the day she'd ordered the executive elevator to be disabled because he said it was unsafe. That day, he'd nodded and said thank you like it was an honor to be noticed. "You're not a lawyer," the prosecutor snapped. "This is a federal case, not a talent show." The courtroom chuckled, briefly, but Caleb didn't flinch. "I'm not here for a show," he said quietly. "I'm here because this chair is empty, and because it shouldn't be." He looked at Eleanor, not with pity, not with awe, just recognition. Like he saw her, behind the headlines, beneath the steel armor of Storm Tech's icy reputation. The judge exhaled. "Mr. Mercer, you understand the risk of representing someone without legal credentials. You will be limited in your role and cannot interfere with court procedure." "I understand." "And Miss Storm," the judge added, "do you accept this man's assistance?" There was a long pause. Eleanor didn't move. The room held its breath. And then, softly, without looking at him, she said, "Yes." The gavel didn't fall. The courtroom never quite recovered from the shock. But the trial resumed, and now Eleanor was no longer alone. Caleb sat beside her, carefully arranging the single file folder he had brought. No legal team, no paralegal, no screensavers with graphs. Just one worn manila folder and a memory too stubborn to fade. She glanced at him, eyebrows faintly raised. "You think this is going to work?" He didn't look up. I don't know. But I remember things others forget. I remember the cleaning crew whispering that your signature was forged. I remember the intern crying in the lobby when the systems glitched and all the camera footage vanished. And I remember you ordering lunch for the whole security staff the day your father died. Eleanor blinked. Caleb didn't smile. I keep watch, Miss Storm. That's my job, even when no one's looking. The opening argument began. The prosecution played videos, read spreadsheets aloud, cited numbers too big for anyone in the gallery to grasp. The portrait painted was one of cold, calculated fraud. Eleanor Storm, an orphan turned tech queen, was cast as the villain who had bled her own company dry. But when the prosecution rested, Caleb stood, slowly. I request time to present new context, he said. You mean evidence? The judge asked. No, Your Honor, Caleb replied. I mean what came before the evidence, before the cameras were turned off. I mean context the jury deserves. The judge narrowed his eyes but gave him the floor. What followed wasn't a legal defense. It was a story. Caleb described the night a shipment record disappeared, the janitor who was fired after raising questions, the elevators that stalled for no reason, the assistant who resigned days before her hard drive was wiped. He didn't have proof, but he had names, patterns, people the board never cared to ask. Eleanor sat frozen, watching the gatekeeper do what no lawyer had dared, bring the invisible into focus. When court recessed, the reporters didn't rush to the prosecution. They surrounded Caleb instead. Are you seriously defending a woman who stole $3.2 billion? Someone shouted. No, he said simply. I'm defending the idea that even powerful women deserve someone to stand next to them when the chair is empty. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. Caleb's words, his defense, his calm presence, unsettled her more than any accusation. For the first time in weeks, she wondered if maybe she wasn't beyond saving. If maybe someone really had been watching, not to judge, but to protect. And when she arrived at the courthouse the next morning, her chair was no longer empty. The night after Caleb Mercer rose in court and shattered the silence, Eleanor Storm returned to the penthouse she no longer called home. The doorman didn't greet her. The security code hadn't been changed, but the silence as she stepped inside felt final, like a house that knew it was no longer wanted. The lights flickered on automatically. Polished steel, dark wood, glass tables, everything in its place. Sterile, soulless, like the version of herself she had built to survive. She took off her coat and poured a glass of water she didn't drink. And then she stood, barefoot in front of the fireplace that hadn't been lit in 5 years. It had all started in this room. The merger, the betrayal, the name Storm Tech on the NASDAQ screen, the deal her adoptive father swore would set her free. She stared at the framed newspaper on the wall. Eleanor Storm, from orphan to CEO in a decade. She tore it down without thinking. Her phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from a restricted number. Sender, unknown. Subject, thought you might want to see what they say about you now. Attachment, video file. Boardroom security cam, 1.5 years ago. She opened it. The clip was grainy, voices muffled, but she recognized the scene instantly. Her own boardroom, the men seated at the table, her adoptive father, Charles Vance, at the head, and her, on screen, walking out of the room with her tablet, just as a vote was being taken. What she hadn't known until this moment was what they said after she left. She thinks she's untouchable, Charles muttered. Let her be the face. We'll handle the rest, another replied. As long as her name signs off on it, no one will look at us. And then laughter, cold, confident, familiar. Eleanor's glass fell from her hand, shattering across the floor. She didn't move, so it had always been true. Her rise was never hers. She was a puppet with expensive shoes. They'd used her, all of them, and she had let them. She didn't sleep that night. At dawn, she walked, past the courthouse, past the tech campus where her photo once covered a 30-foot billboard, through the back alley of Storm Tech's headquarters, the place where janitors smoked on break and no one wore tailored suits. She wasn't followed. She didn't care. And when she arrived at the old warehouse once used for archives, she stood before a door sealed years ago under confidential restructuring orders. The lock was new, but she remembered the override code. Inside was dust, racks of boxed files, a fan still spinning faintly, as if refusing to forget how to stop. She found the folder by instinct more than memory. Storm 1123X, Internal Communications, Vance. Inside, memos, transfer orders, notes signed not with her name, but forged versions of it. Sloppy copies, digitally time-stamped for days she had been across the country. Eleanor's mouth tightened. These were the authorizations used to launder over $2.7 billion, and every last one had her name. Except she'd never seen them. She sat on the floor, cross-legged, in the silence. For the first time since the trial began, Eleanor allowed herself to feel something dangerously close to grief. Not for the company, not for her lost name, but for the version of herself who had once believed she was leading something good. Later that morning, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Reporters whispered about Caleb Mercer. Was he a hero or a fool? But Eleanor's seat wasn't empty today. She entered 5 minutes early, her jaw set, her blouse crisp. But her eyes, those sharp gray eyes, looked different. Caleb noticed immediately. "You found something." She didn't answer. She opened her laptop and passed it to him. The video. Caleb leaned closer, listening. When it ended, he looked at her carefully. This could change everything." "No," she said softly. "It confirms everything. I was never meant to lead. I was just meant to be blamed." He opened his mouth to respond, but the bailiff called for order. The trial resumed, and Eleanor took the stand. There was no preparation, no coaching, no makeup artist, just a woman with a shattered name and a voice steadier than ever. "I didn't steal from my company," she said, "but I trusted men who did. And I signed papers because I was told it was normal, because I was taught never to question the people who saved me." The prosecutor stood. "Are you saying you were a victim?" "No," Eleanor replied. "I'm saying I was a survivor, and there's a difference." The courtroom was silent. When she stepped down, Caleb didn't clap or smile. He simply whispered, "You're not done yet." And Eleanor Storm, for the first time in months, nodded, not with defiance, but with belief. Not in the system, not in the verdict, but in herself. The elevators at Stormtech's Midtown Tower still remembered Caleb Mercer. They beeped the same chime he used to hear at 6 o'clock a.m. when arriving early to polish the lobby floors, long before the CEOs and analysts arrived. The janitor's key card had been deactivated, but he didn't need it now. He had a new badge. Special Investigator, Temp Access, courtesy of a court order and a reluctant judge who had agreed to let Caleb follow a hunch. The security guard at the front desk glanced up as he passed but said nothing. Maybe he remembered the way Caleb used to refill the vending machine, how he knew every corner of this building like a second home. But no one ever really saw the gatekeepers. That's why they could hide secrets in plain sight. Caleb stepped into the service elevator and hit the button for the basement archives. Level B3. The doors groaned shut, and memories flooded back. He had worked this elevator for 19 years. Carried shredded files, coffee spills, forgotten handbags from the 37th floor. He'd heard more hallway whispers than any lawyer ever would. He knew which board members whispered when their wives weren't around, which assistants cried in the bathroom after late-night meetings. But one memory kept resurfacing. The night he saw Charles Vance carrying a hard drive down to the restricted basement. No assistant, no tech support. Just Charles, flushed, sweaty, and paranoid. That was 6 months before the audit. No one had asked Caleb what he'd seen. Until now. Basement B3 was cold. Always had been. Rows of server towers blinked quietly. The room buzzed with a low, steady hum. Caleb walked past rows of decommissioned drives and stopped at the far wall, where the restricted node used to be. He knelt and felt behind the metal casing, still loose. He pried it open. There it was, a hidden fiber channel input, patched crudely behind insulation. The port was dusty, forgotten, but it confirmed his memory wasn't faulty. Charles had uploaded something here, outside the company's firewall, untraceable, unless someone still had the decryption sequence. Caleb pulled a flash drive from his pocket, one given by a former IT manager who'd left Storm Tech quietly last year after being encouraged to resign. The man had always liked Caleb, said he was the only one who thanked the night crew. Caleb plugged in the drive. The fans whirred louder, and a folder bloomed onto the screen. Storm Lockbox 421, confidential. His heart kicked. He opened it. Thousands of PDFs, email logs, transfers between shell companies, internal authorizations under Eleanor's name, times, dates, locations, all of it pointing to a systematic siphoning of assets, initiated not by Eleanor, but by Charles Vance and 2 other board members. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Someone was coming. He killed the screen, yanked the drive, and stepped into the shadows. The door opened. A flashlight beam swept across the racks. "Who's down here?" a gruff voice barked. It was Ramon, a former security contractor, one of the few who had recognized Caleb's face earlier in the week and didn't like him back in the day. Caleb stayed still. Then Ramon turned and whispered into his comms, "He's here. Basement 3. Panic surged through Caleb's chest. He sprinted. Metal grated under his boots as he zigzagged through aisles. Ramon shouted and gave chase. The elevator was too far. Caleb headed for the old stairwell instead, used only during drills. He flung the door open, heart pounding, lungs heaving. Up, up, up. He reached B2. Ramon's voice echoed from below. "Stop running, Mercer. You think they'll protect you?" But Caleb didn't stop. Not now. He had something they couldn't erase. Back in his tiny apartment that night, Caleb booted up his laptop and backed up the folder onto 4 separate drives. One went under the floorboards, one taped behind the fridge, one in a hollowed-out dictionary, and the 4th? He placed in an envelope addressed to a woman in upstate New York. For Eleanor Storm, to be opened if I disappear. He stared at the envelope a long time before sealing it. Some memories, he thought, aren't just scars. They're keys. The courtroom was unusually silent. Even the judge, the stoic Honorable Marla Gaines of the Southern District of New York, seemed to hesitate before speaking. A quiet tension hummed in the air as the projector screen warmed up behind her. Caleb stood by the witness podium, hands slightly trembling, holding the small USB drive he'd carried like a loaded weapon for 3 days. Eleanor sat still, composed, but pale. She hadn't spoken since the previous day, when her own attorney resigned in shame after admitting to being bribed by the board. Today, Caleb Mercer, former janitor, now acting as Eleanor's legal proxy, was about to present evidence that could flip the entire case, or backfire. Mr. Mercer, the judge said, tapping her gavel once, you are not an attorney, but this court has, under exceptional circumstances, granted you this slot. Proceed with your submission. Caleb nodded. He cleared his throat, stepped forward, and inserted the USB into the court laptop. Your Honor, he began, his voice low but firm. What you are about to see is from the basement archive of Storm Tech. These files were deleted, erased. I recovered them with help from a former systems engineer, and they show the money trail. He clicked play. The screen lit up. Security footage, grainy but clear, time-stamped. It showed Charles Vance entering the basement archive room at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night. He wasn't alone. 2 other board members followed, Nathan Doyle and Madeline Frost. Vance was holding a hard drive. Madeline stood watch. Nathan keyed in override codes. The footage fast-forwarded to a screen showing an unauthorized data dump. Then came the logs. Eleanor's name appeared, on forged authorizations. The timestamps coincided with days when she was provably out of state, including at a medical retreat following her mother's death. Matching travel logs were already on file. Caleb paused the footage. If you read closely, you'll see that StormTech accounts were being bled by offshore subsidiaries controlled by these 3 people. A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Even the court stenographer looked up. Eleanor's eyes welled up, but she didn't cry. She stared straight at the screen, straight at the past. But then, it happened. Objection! A loud voice called out from the prosecution bench. It was Richard Talbot, the district attorney, red-faced, holding a sheaf of documents. This footage, he said, waving the pages, has just been submitted for verification by a third-party forensic expert, and according to their preliminary analysis, the metadata has been tampered with. The room fell to a hush. Judge Gaines narrowed her eyes. On what grounds? Talbot strode toward the bench. The timestamps were modified. The video may have been edited, and our expert also notes anomalies in the file header that could indicate reconstruction. We request that the evidence be dismissed pending full review. A gasp from the back row. Eleanor turned sharply to Caleb. He looked stunned because he hadn't touched the metadata, but someone else had. Someone who'd accessed the backup, maybe even the original source. Someone still working for the board? Judge Gaines frowned deeply. Given this objection and lack of independent authentication, I must, regretfully, dismiss this evidence from the record. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. Your Honor, I swear on my life this footage is real, he said, stepping forward, emotion rising in his chest. I worked those floors. I saw them. I remember that night. It's real. That may be, the judge said softly, but memories are not admissible as fact. Bang. The gavel fell. The screen went dark. Later that night, back in the courthouse hallway, Eleanor slumped onto a bench. The day had stripped her bare. She looked like a queen dethroned, still proud, still upright, but with battle scars showing through her silence. Caleb approached slowly. He sat beside her, both watching as the courtroom emptied out through double doors. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I thought I had it." "You did," she replied, surprising him. Her voice was calm. "They just got to it before we could." She turned to him. "They're scared, Caleb. That's why they're moving faster now. They know we're getting close." He looked at her. "Then what do we do?" She exhaled. "We go back. To the root." The next morning, Eleanor showed up at his apartment holding a stack of old company directories. "I want to know who was working the night shifts back then," she said. "Not executives, not managers, the invisible ones, janitors, cleaners, drivers. I need everyone who saw something and was never asked to testify." Caleb took the list. "Let's make them visible," he said. Together they began dialing numbers. Names long erased from the company payroll came back to life. People like Nancy, a janitor who remembered seeing Nathan Doyle with cash envelopes. Jerome, a driver who picked up Charles from a printing shop late at night. Mai, a cafeteria worker who had overheard Project Lockbox during a catering order. Eleanor took it all in, every call, every voice. And on the fifth call, they reached a retired mailroom clerk named Tom Herrera. "I remember a manila envelope," Tom said over speakerphone, "delivered to Eleanor's office, but I was told to put it straight into Vance's hands. I always thought that was strange." "What was in it?" Caleb asked. "Don't know, but it had her name, her signature. It was weird." Eleanor went still. "I never signed that," she said. That night, Eleanor sat on the balcony of Caleb's small apartment, looking out over Queens. Her coat wrapped tight. Her fingers gripped a teacup. Caleb joined her, pouring 2 cups of black coffee. "I've spent years learning to be feared," she whispered, "and it kept me alive. But it never kept me warm." "You're not the only one who had to survive that way," Caleb replied. Silence lingered between them. Then Eleanor said something she hadn't said in years. "I need help." Caleb just nodded. No one wins alone. The apartment hadn't been touched in years. Dust hung in the air like memory. The curtains, yellowed and stiff, hadn't moved since the day the police sealed the door. Eleanor stood in the hallway of the old pre-war building on West 84th Street, key in hand, breath shallow. This was once the home of Philip Marchand, her former guardian. The man who'd raised her after she was found sleeping under a fire escape at age 12. The man who took her in, clothed her, taught her finance and fear in equal measure. The man who left behind silence, sealed rooms, and whispers. And the man she hadn't visited, not once, since the day she took over as CEO. Until now. Caleb waited by the elevator, his arms crossed but his heart hammering. "I can go in with you," he offered softly. "No," Eleanor said, voice flat. "If there are things in there meant for me, then I need to be the one to face them." She turned the key. The door creaked open with a groan that sounded like it remembered her name. Inside, the apartment smelled of old books and dried scotch. Papers still lay scattered where federal agents had rifled through drawers. A photo frame faced down on the coffee table. She didn't pick it up. Eleanor moved through the space slowly. Each room was a ghost. The den, the fireplace, the leather chair where Philip used to read aloud the Wall Street Journal like it was gospel. Then the study, the place she had never been allowed to enter. She stood at the threshold, hand trembling on the doorknob, remembering his words. "Only people who build empires belong in here, Ellie, not girls who sleep in alleys." But she had built one, and it nearly cost her everything. She turned the knob. The door opened. The study was immaculate. Books aligned with military precision. Ledgers, files, an old rotary phone, and a safe embedded behind a false cabinet wall. Eleanor stared at it. It had no digital panel, only a 3-digit dial and a brass handle. Caleb entered behind her, wordless. She turned. "He never gave me the code." Caleb stepped closer. What did he care about more than anything? "Power," she whispered. "No, before that." She thought. Closed her eyes. Philip was ruthless, yes. But he had one weakness. A company. A merger he had lost decades ago. She remembered the way he used to talk about it with bitterness, even when she was just a teenager. If only I'd kept control of 614. She opened her eyes. 614. Her fingers spun the dial. 6, 1, 4. Click. The safe creaked open. Inside, 2 manila folders and a single black cassette tape. She pulled out the tape. Old-fashioned, unlabeled. "Do you still have that Walkman in your basement?" she asked Caleb. He nodded slowly. 10 minutes later, they sat in Caleb's tiny kitchen. The cassette player whirred to life. Philip's voice poured through the speakers, gravelly, sharp. "Ellie, if you're hearing this, it means either I'm dead or someone's finally come knocking. Either way, you're probably CEO by now. Congratulations. Or condolences." Eleanor's hands went white around her mug. "I've left 2 things behind. First, the red folder. That's every offshore account, every shell company, every bribe I ever paid. It's all there. And yes, your name is on some of it. I made sure of that." She swallowed hard. "But the blue folder? Read it. That one will tell you why I did what I did, why I built Stormtech to be untouchable, and why I always kept you close, but never let you in." There was a pause, then, softer, "You reminded me too much of the daughter I lost." Silence. Then the tape clicked. They opened the red folder first. It was a financial minefield. Hundreds of account numbers, transfers to Madeline Frost, to Nathan Doyle, even Charles Vance. Evidence, real, verifiable, time-stamped, cross-signed. But also 5 fake authorizations signed under Eleanor's name. Her reputation had been built atop a foundation of lies she didn't even know she stood on. She felt sick. Then she opened the blue folder. Inside, a single letter, dated 10 years ago, addressed to no one. To the one who finds this, it read, I destroyed a child once, not by beating her, not by starving her, but by giving her everything, except love. Eleanor was smarter than I ever expected. I taught her to win, but never to rest, to lead, but never to trust. And in doing so, I raised a queen who never learned how to be a girl. Stormtech became the only home she had, and I poisoned it too. I know they'll come for her one day. I built a system so cutthroat, even she couldn't survive it. So here's my final act of control. Let this file free her. Eleanor dropped the paper. Caleb caught it before it hit the floor. She stared ahead, frozen. The man I trusted most, she whispered, created the system that's now trying to destroy me. And left you the key to dismantle it, Caleb added. She looked at him, eyes raw. You think this is enough? He held up the folders. No, but it's enough to bring it all down, with the right voices. That night, Eleanor stood in front of her old apartment, the wind howling against the stoop. She held both folders tight to her chest. Then she pulled out her phone, dialed a number she had kept buried for years. Hi, she said when the line picked up. It's Eleanor Marchand. I need a forensic accountant who doesn't scare easy. A pause, then a gruff laugh on the other end. I've been waiting for this call for a decade. The courtroom door creaked open just as the clerk finished reciting the charges. A gust of wind swept in from the hallway, scattering a few loose pages from the court stenographer's desk. All eyes turned, some in impatience, others in idle curiosity. A tall man stood in the doorway. He was in his late 50s, perhaps early 60s, clean-shaven, sharply dressed, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly to the side. But it was his posture, too confident for a spectator, and the briefcase handcuffed to his wrist that caused a ripple of silence to fall over the room like a dropped velvet curtain. Eleanor turned to Caleb, her lips barely moving. Do you know him? Caleb shook his head slowly. But I know trouble when I see it. The judge leaned forward. State your name, sir. The man stepped forward with the assurance of someone accustomed to rooms with glass ceilings and golden gates. My name is Raymond Dorsey, he said, voice smooth as varnished oak. I'm a former senior legal advisor for Stormtech. Eleanor stiffened. That name. She hadn't heard it in nearly a decade. I'm here to submit a confidential contract signed by Ms. Eleanor Storm herself that directly contradicts her sworn testimony from 2 days ago. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like aftershocks. The judge narrowed his eyes. You're here as a witness? Why were you not summoned during discovery? Raymond lifted his handcuffed briefcase. Because this document was sealed under executive privilege and hidden in a legal trust only triggered by a material breach of corporate conduct. That trigger happened 2 weeks ago. I received a notification, and I flew here last night. He approached the bench. With the court's permission, I request to submit this into evidence. The bailiff took the briefcase, unlocked it with Raymond's guidance, and pulled out a thin manila folder. Inside was a contract. 10 pages, neatly notarized. Caleb's pulse quickened as he glanced over the document. It bore Eleanor's signature, her full legal name, and Stormtech's corporate seal. The date was from 9 years ago. The courtroom grew quiet. Too quiet. Judge Martinez read the document in silence. Then she passed it to the opposing counsel. The prosecutor pounced on it like a lion given fresh meat. This contradicts Ms. Storm's sworn statement that she never authorized direct dividends to external shell companies. This shows she did, through her own signature. The gallery erupted. Phones buzzed. Reporters whispered feverishly. Eleanor's hands went cold. That signature. It's mine. but I don't remember signing this. I swear. Caleb stood slowly. Your Honor, I request a recess. I'd like to question the validity of this document. Judge Martinez frowned. You're suggesting forgery? I'm suggesting manipulation. She paused. You have 24 hours, Mr. Lane. Back at Eleanor's hotel suite that night, the air was thick with unease. I don't remember ever meeting Raymond Dorsey, Eleanor said, pacing by the window. But that signature, it looks real. Too real. Caleb sat at the coffee table, analyzing high-res scans of the contract. It's not just your signature. It's the terms. They're too careful. Too clean. It's the kind of contract built to bury someone if needed. Eleanor turned sharply. What are you saying? I think this was planted years ago, like a loaded gun, waiting on the shelf, just in case you ever became a threat. She stared out at the skyline. That sounds paranoid. No, Caleb said. That sounds like corporate law at its ugliest. The next morning, Caleb returned to the courthouse, not to file a motion, but to follow a hunch. He'd spent all night contacting former janitors and building maintenance staff from the old StormTech HQ. One of them, a man named Elias, had worked graveyard shift for over 15 years. He remembered Raymond Dorsey, vividly. Yeah, I remember him, Elias said over the phone. He used to hold closed-door meetings with Richard Crane. Crane? Caleb sat up straighter. That was Eleanor's old CFO, the one who testified against her. They'd meet late, after hours. I used to vacuum outside the glass conference room. Thought it was weird they whispered even when no one else was in the building. Do you have badge logs, entry records? Elias paused. I do. I copied mine every month to keep track of my hours. Can I meet you today? Elias agreed. By noon, Caleb had a full copy of the night logs from 10 years ago. On the date the contract was signed, Eleanor wasn't in the building. Her security badge never registered. But Raymond Dorsey and Richard Crane were both there, between 10:03 p.m. and 12:17 a.m. Back in court, Caleb requested to recall Raymond Dorsey to the stand. Raymond sat with ease, his fingers interlaced, lips pursed. Mr. Dorsey, Caleb began, can you confirm the date Ms. Storm signed that contract was February 3rd, 2015? Yes. And you were in the building that night? I was. Was Ms. Storm? Raymond smirked. She was. I recall it vividly. Caleb raised the security badge log. This shows she wasn't. Her badge never triggered the front door or elevator. But yours did. And so did Richard Crane's. Raymond's smile wavered. And you want the court to believe this signature is genuine, when the person who allegedly signed it wasn't even in the building? The room went silent again. Raymond tried to speak. There may have been no further questions, Your Honor. The judge examined the logs, then turned to the prosecutor. Do you have any evidence to validate Mr. Dorsey's claim? The prosecutor sat frozen, jaw tight. I do not, Your Honor. Then this contract will be stricken from evidence until further authentication. And Mr. Dorsey? She fixed him with a steely gaze. You are hereby placed under court investigation for possible perjury and fraudulent submission of evidence. The gavel struck. Sharp. Final. Eleanor closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. As the courtroom emptied, Caleb lingered near the threshold, where Raymond had first stood, the place between guilt and justice, betrayal and truth. Eleanor walked up beside him. "That could have buried me." Caleb nodded. "But it didn't." She turned to him. "You always stand there, don't you?" He blinked. "Where?" "At thresholds, watching everything. Never quite inside, never quite outside." He smiled softly. "That's what gatekeepers do." She looked up at him with something almost like affection. "Well, I'm done standing at the edge of things." She reached out. And for the first time in the whole trial, Eleanor Storm took someone's hand. The morning sun cast sharp lines across the marble floor of the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse. It was the final day of testimony. A low hum of expectation filled the courtroom. The air felt charged, not with rage, but with resolution. Rumors of the forged contract had reached every news outlet by sunrise. Commentators speculated. Shareholders panicked. Prosecutors scrambled. And yet, as Eleanor Storm entered the courtroom that day, she did not shrink. She wore a simple navy dress and a plain silver necklace, the kind her mother used to wear on Sundays. There was no makeup, no armor, just her and the truth. But what no one expected, what not even Caleb anticipated, was what came next. Because Eleanor Storm did not walk to the defense table, she walked directly to the witness stand. A buzz went through the gallery like static crackling along a telephone wire. "Your Honor," Eleanor said clearly, "with permission, I request to testify on my own behalf." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you aware, Ms. Storm, that your counsel has not advised this?" "I am, but I have stayed silent long enough." She looked at Caleb, who had risen halfway from his chair, stunned. "I trust him, but this I have to say in my own voice." Judge Martinez glanced down at the legal pad in front of her, then slowly nodded. "You may proceed." The bailiff swore her in. Eleanor sat, hands folded neatly on her lap. The prosecutor stepped up first. "Ms. Storm, let's clarify something. You claim you had no knowledge of the shell accounts used to siphon funds from Storm Tech. That's correct. Yet you were CEO. All contracts went through you." "They went through my office. Not always through me." The prosecutor arched a brow. "Are you suggesting your CFO acted without your consent?" Eleanor took a breath. "I'm not suggesting. I'm stating it as fact." He leaned forward. "So you're saying your own executive team betrayed you?" "Yes, because they knew I had started asking questions." "About what?" Eleanor's voice grew steadier. "About the missing funds from our community grant programs. About why our relief centers in upstate New York never received their winter allocations. About why, in the middle of a record-breaking fourth quarter, our employee retirement fund froze without explanation." The prosecutor took a step back. The jury was listening now, intently. "And you never signed any contracts with shell companies?" "I did not." "And you have no memory of signing the one submitted yesterday?" Eleanor turned to the jury. "That document was prepared without my knowledge during a time I wasn't in the building. Security logs prove that. And my name, my reputation, was used to protect the people stealing from the company I built." The room went still. "And why didn't you speak out sooner?" Eleanor hesitated. Her eyes flicked briefly to the gallery, where photographers waited like vultures. "Because I was grieving." The prosecutor blinked. "Grieving?" I lost my son 3 weeks before I was removed from the board. A ripple of shock passed through the room. He died of preventable sepsis in one of the clinics I funded. A clinic that never received the emergency supplies I'd allocated. Supplies that were budgeted, but never arrived. She paused, swallowed. That's when I knew. Something was terribly wrong. I tried to dig, but every file was locked, every conversation recorded. Then, suddenly, I was labeled unstable, removed by a 3-2 board vote, and sent a letter of forced retirement. The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it again. He turned to the judge. No further questions. Caleb rose slowly. Ms. Storm, he said gently, you spoke of your son. Why haven't you shared that before? Eleanor's voice cracked. Because grief is a language no one wants to hear in courtrooms. What was his name? David. And what did he love? Trains, blueberry pie, reading maps even though he couldn't pronounce the city names. A soft chuckle moved through the room, then quiet. Caleb stepped closer. You mentioned the clinic where David passed lacked emergency supplies. Who was responsible for distribution oversight? The CFO, Richard Crane. Same man who testified against you? Yes. Same man caught in the badge logs with Raymond Dorsey forging your contract? Yes. Caleb turned to the jury. I want you to picture a mother, former CEO, grieving, ousted by force, watching her life's work collapse and being told she's the criminal. He let it hang. Now picture the people who profited from her silence. No further words were needed. Outside the courtroom, the sky had begun to cloud, but inside the storm had passed. Judge Martinez leaned forward. In light of the testimony provided and the new investigation into the forged contract, I am suspending this trial until the district attorney's office completes its fraud inquiry. At exactly 9:03 a.m., the courtroom doors opened, and someone unexpected walked in. Not a lawyer, not a board member, not a shareholder, a janitor. He wore a faded gray StormTech uniform and held a mop handle in one hand. His name tag read, Manny, and as he stepped across the polished floor, all eyes turned. But Manny didn't flinch. He walked straight toward the judge's bench with a quiet resolve. Your Honor, he said in a firm, unshaken voice, I have something to say about Eleanor Storm. The room fell still. Judge Martinez blinked. And you are. Manuel Reyes, custodian, 21 years at StormTech headquarters. I worked every floor, every hallway, including the CEO suite. The judge raised an eyebrow. Are you represented by counsel? No, ma'am, I just want the truth on record, for her. Martinez hesitated, then slowly nodded. Proceed. Briefly. Manny stepped up to the stand, hand trembling slightly as he swore in. I was on cleaning duty the night that contract was supposedly signed. I remember it clearly. Ms. Storm wasn't there. Her office was locked, but two men were, CFO Richard Crane and legal counsel Raymond Dorsey. Gasps echoed in the room. I saw them enter at 10:14 p.m. with a brown folder. They came out at 10:52. They didn't know I was there behind the supply closet. I heard one of them say, she'll never know what hit her. Caleb closed his eyes. A thread of memory clicked into place. Manny looked down, voice quiet. I was afraid to say anything before. I've got a son with a lung condition. I couldn't risk losing my job. But when I saw Eleanor speak yesterday, he looked up. I remembered who built our free clinic, who sent us Thanksgiving meals every year. I realized, if someone like her could lose everything for doing the right thing, then I better find the courage to do the same. Silence stretched like a held breath. Judge Martinez finally nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Reyes." But Manny didn't leave. He turned to the courtroom. "I'm not the only one." A whisper rose in the gallery. Then, from the back row, a woman stood. "I'm Clara Jennings, secretary, 18 years. She walked forward. "I saw the finance team hiding expense reports. They told me not to print ledger sheets for Q4. Said the board didn't need to see it. I knew something was wrong." Another stood, then another. "I drove her to Cold Hollow after she was fired," said a man in a StormTech driver's uniform. "She cried the whole way, but still thanked me for the ride." "I'm Sheila," said the mail clerk, voice cracking. "She once stayed after hours to help me read my daughter's IEP form because I didn't understand what the school meant." One by one they came forward, janitors, drivers, assistants, cafeteria staff, invisible people, now visible. People who had never been invited into the boardroom but who had seen, day after day, the quiet strength of a woman they called Ms. Storm with reverence. Not because she was powerful, but because she was present. Caleb leaned close to Eleanor, his voice barely a whisper. "They're showing up for you." "No," she whispered. "They're showing up for each other." And in that moment, Eleanor understood something deeper than vindication. She hadn't built a company. She'd built a community. The prosecution, rattled and scrambling, objected to the spontaneous testimony. Judge Martinez overruled them. "If these people have truth to share, this courtroom will hear it." By noon, 35 StormTech employees had taken the stand. None were executives. All told the same story. A woman who stood for integrity, who remembered birthdays and buried their dead, who sat beside them when HR wouldn't listen, who used her own bonus to cover overdue healthcare plans after a corporate freeze. A woman who, when betrayed, didn't lash out, but went silent. Until now. The final witness that day was a man named Peter Green. He was blind, but he walked with quiet confidence, led by the arm of his teenage daughter. His voice was gravelly from years of chemical exposure on factory floors. "I was one of the first employees at StormTech," he said softly. "I lost my sight in 2009 due to a chemical fire in our early labs. I thought I'd be discarded." He turned his face toward the jury. "But Eleanor Storm came to my hospital room herself. She cried when I told her I was afraid of never working again. You know what she said?" He smiled faintly. "She said, 'Then we'll build something you can do, Peter. And you'll do it better than anyone else.'" The jury sat motionless. "She hired me as our first accessibility consultant. My team helped rebuild the entire campus for disabled workers. Because of her, I saw again. Not with my eyes, but with my life." And as the judge adjourned for the day, Eleanor felt something shift, not just in the courtroom, but in the world. For the first time, the ones who had always been overlooked were writing history, not with wealth or titles, but with truth. And for the first time in years, Eleanor let herself cry. Not from sorrow, but from the quiet, powerful relief of finally being seen. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning hum. Judge Martinez's gavel echoed once, then again, firm and final. After reviewing all testimonies, including the spontaneous declarations of employees, the court finds no sufficient grounds to hold Eleanor Storm criminally liable for financial fraud. The case is dismissed. A breath, then an eruption. Caleb exhaled sharply. Emma threw her arms around her father. Eleanor didn't move. She just stared ahead, lips trembling, eyes wide, like someone who had been waiting 10 years to hear those words, and wasn't sure if she was awake. The storm was over, but the reckoning had just begun. That afternoon, Eleanor returned to StormTech. Not to the polished boardroom or the glass-walled executive suite. She walked past the security desk, where Manny now stood a little taller, and straight into the heart of the building, the employee cafeteria. It was full. Word had spread. When she entered, people stood. Not one person clapped. Not yet. They waited, watching. And then Eleanor, still in the same navy suit she wore to court, stepped up to the podium in the center of the room. She looked out not at shareholders, but at secretaries, custodians, mechanics, programmers, nurses, drivers, receptionists. And finally, she spoke. "I spent 20 years building this company," Eleanor began quietly, her voice steady. "And somewhere along the way, I let others convince me that leadership meant detachment, that to protect my vision, I had to protect myself. From you." She paused. Her voice wavered, but didn't break. "They were wrong, and I was wrong for believing them." She took a breath, then placed a black leather folder on the table. Inside it, resignation letters. Every single member of the former board, signed. Caleb had delivered them that morning. "I'm here not to reclaim power," she continued, "but to rebuild trust. And we'll start by doing what should have been done years ago." She turned the folder around. "I am dissolving the current board of directors, effective immediately." Gasps. Stunned silence. Then a rising murmur. Eleanor raised her voice. "In its place, we will form a new governing body made up of people who represent every department. You will elect them, not for wealth, not for seniority, but for integrity." She looked up. "And if you want me to stay on, not as a queen upstairs, but as a servant among you, then I will." A long beat. Then someone clapped, and then another, until the room thundered, not with applause for a hero, but for a homecoming. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of rebirth. The media storm, once cruel, turned. Major outlets that had painted Eleanor as a villain now scrambled to correct course. StormTech reforms from the inside. The CEO who listened. Power to the people. But Eleanor didn't care about headlines. She was in the mailroom, redesigning communication chains. She sat with Clara Jennings, the secretary who testified, and together they rewrote hiring policies. She met with Peter Green, the blind accessibility consultant, and asked him to co-lead the new wellness division. And then she asked Caleb. They were standing on the rooftop garden at dusk. It had once been reserved for board retreats. Now it was open to all employees, a quiet place to rest above the noise. "I want you to run something," Eleanor said. Caleb looked up, brow furrowed. "Me?" She nodded. "The new Justice and Ethics Department. I want you to lead investigations, shape policy, hold leadership accountable. Even me." He blinked. "But I'm just—" "No," she interrupted. "You're the only one who knew what was right, and had the courage to say it, even when it cost you everything." He swallowed hard. "Will you do it?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked at Emma, who was sitting on a bench nearby, sketching a mural idea for the new employee lounge. He thought about his late wife, about how she once told him, "You were never meant to stay silent, Caleb. You were meant to be a bridge." He turned back to Eleanor. "Yes," he said. And somewhere deep inside, a long locked door opened. On the company's relaunch day, Eleanor stood in front of the new Storm Tech banner. A company where everyone matters. There was no champagne, no fireworks, just a microphone and a shared breath. She began the ceremony not with a speech, but with a moment of silence. "For every voice we ignored," she said softly. "For every time we forgot who built this place." Then she smiled. "But never again." And in that room, it wasn't just a company reborn. It was a family rediscovered. It was a cold morning in November when Eleanor stood before a gravestone she hadn't visited in 16 years. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the Hudson River, not far from where Caleb had lived all his life. Autumn leaves crunched beneath her boots as she approached the grave alone, holding a single white lily in her hand. The name etched into the granite read, Rebecca Lane, wife, mother, healer of strangers. She kneeled slowly, not as a CEO, not as a woman who had just survived the corporate storm of a century, but as a girl who had once slept in bus stations, a girl who had hidden in the back alley behind Storm Tech's campus, a girl who had believed no one would ever see her again. "I never got to say thank you," Eleanor whispered. Her voice cracked. "She found me in the rain," Eleanor continued, tracing the carved letters with her fingers. "Offered me soup, gave me a blanket, told me not to be afraid." She looked up through tearful eyes, and she didn't ask for anything. Behind her, a familiar voice broke the silence. She never did. Caleb stood there, holding a thermos of coffee and 2 mugs. He stepped beside her, crouched down, and placed a photo on the grave. Rebecca with baby Emma in her arms. "She used to talk about you," Caleb said quietly. "That Christmas night, when she came home soaked and smiling. She said she met a girl with fire in her eyes. Told me, that one's going to change the world, just wait." Eleanor wiped her face. "I didn't know she was your wife until the trial," she said. "And by then, I didn't know how to say it." "You just did," he replied. They stood there for a long time. Not as gatekeeper and queen, not as CEO and whistleblower, but as 2 people bound by a shared loss and a shared debt. One Eleanor had been carrying for half her life. And then she reached into her coat and handed Caleb a folder. "What's this?" he asked. "The new Storm Tech Reform Initiative. It's officially launching next spring. We'll be funding community schools, trauma clinics, small business grants, and legal clinics for blue-collar families. But it needs a face the people trust." He opened the folder. His own name was printed at the top. Caleb Lane, Honorary Executive Director. "I can't," he started. "You already have," Eleanor interrupted. "You built this with me, whether you meant to or not." She hesitated. "And there's one more thing." Later that week, Eleanor stood in front of the largest crowd Storm Tech had ever assembled. Employees, partners, families. The cafeteria could no longer hold them. so the company rented out a local auditorium in Yonkers. A banner hung behind her. Storm Tech, powered by people. She took the microphone and looked out over the sea of faces. When I was 15, I was sleeping in an abandoned building 3 blocks from here, she said. I thought no one would ever know my name, that I'd die a ghost in the system. She paused. But a woman I didn't know offered me soup, and a man she loved gave me a second chance, long before either of us understood why. She looked at Caleb, seated front row next to Emma. That's what love is, she continued. It's not a feeling. It's not even forgiveness. It's what we do. It's the way we show up when no one's watching, when there's nothing to gain. She held up a small framed photo. It was a drawing, Emma's drawing, the same mural she'd sketched on the rooftop weeks earlier, of hands reaching out, one from above, one from below. A bridge, and in the center, between them, a little girl standing in the light. That's who we do this for, Eleanor said. The ones no one sees, the ones still waiting. The applause rose like a tide. Caleb stood and hugged her, not as a hero, not as a man who had lost everything and gained it back, but as someone who had come home. As someone who finally believed he was never invisible to begin with. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Hudson and the city lights shimmered to life, the 3 of them, Eleanor, Caleb, and Emma, sat quietly in a diner near the old Storm Tech lot. No reporters, no shareholders, just a father, a daughter, and the girl who had once believed she had no name. They split a milkshake. They laughed about the security camera footage that started it all. And when the waitress asked what they were celebrating, Eleanor smiled and said, "Justice." And then, softly, "Family."